Growing up near the Irish coast in a family of boat builders, Ferreira's deep connection to the sea fueled his passion for cleaning water, inspiring him to solve the problem. Sitting in chemistry class, 15-year-old Fionn's teacher was conducting an experiment on how to magnetise an oil mixture and turn it into a ferrofluid. At this moment, an idea came to him. What if he magnetised his own oil and then used this magnetic liquid to remove microplastics from water? And that was the moment when he turned his passion into a concrete idea. Game Changer, an audio series about innovative changemakers. Today's game changer is Fionn Ferreira. Fionn is an Irish inventor, chemistry student, and Forbes 30 under 30 listee. Throughout his studies, Fionn continued to develop his invention and began entering his work in various fairs and competitions. In 2020, he founded both Fionn & Co LLC and the Green Journey Coalition Inc. to continue his mission of cleaning the world's oceans and preserving the environment. Ferreira is a scientist and innovator committed to making a positive impact on the world. Hello and welcome, Fionn.
Hi.
Hey, how are you doing this morning?
Really good. I'm high energy, enjoying myself. I think I enjoyed my way into studio, so I'm fresh and ready to hopefully share a little bit about what I do.
Well, I'm happy to hear that. It's a real pleasure to have you on the show. And I've been fangirling you, I've got to be honest, looking at all the incredible things you've been doing on your social media and all the incredible things you're getting up to. You're a speaker, a scientist. You seem to have travelled a lot of the world, seen some incredible things and had some incredible inspiration, I'm sure, which we're going to be hearing all about. Where are you dialing in from today?
I'm actually speaking from London. I'm here on a little work trip. Later today, I'll be speaking in the Commonwealth House for a lovely event that they're hosting. So, I'm speaking from London to you today.
Well, and I noticed on your socials you speak German as well. Am I right in thinking?
Yeah, so I also speak German and Portuguese and Irish and Dutch.
Wow, that's quite a collection of languages. I'm always in awe of anyone who can speak multiple languages. I think it's super impressive. So
yeah, I don't know. I feel like for me, the more languages you know, the more you pick up, right? I've got German and Portuguese parents, so I think that definitely helps. But then over time, it feels like it's easier and easier to learn another language. I don't know, you realize patterns, and I think it changes very much the way that you actually think about languages as a whole.
Yeah, I certainly found that. I can speak French. I'm quite proud to say, as an English speaker, I can add one other language to my list. And it does give you the kind of basic key of how languages work, I guess, when you learn them.
Absolutely.
So I want to just dive in really and ask you all about, the incredible work that you've been doing, the things that inspired you, and this whole love of the ocean and the idea of cleaning the ocean, which is something that gets talked about so much. As someone who's passionate about the ocean myself, I'm a surfer, I love paddleboarding, and I guess I'm well aware of places I've been to where you just see all this plastic and pollution washing up on shores. What was the thing that really inspired you to start on this journey?
Well, I think we're all probably listening to this and on this familiar with plastic waste in the oceans and plastic waste in the sea. I think if you've walked past a canal or a river or even on a beach, you've probably seen plastic there. But when I was a lot younger, I never really associated this with actually doing harm because, okay, it's litter. It looks terrible on the seashore. It looks like it could be really, really bad for wildlife. But actually how, right? I mean, these are solids. These are large pieces. Like, unless an animal decides to eat that huge plastic bottle, which I think is pretty unlikely. Like, we can see that a lot of animals are pretty smart. It's unlikely that that it's going to cause a lot of harm. So I think what kind of pushed me to actually wanting to do something about the problem and not just think that it looks ugly and that, it's bad for the environment in terms of visuals, but also a lot worse than that, was when I started learning about these plastics breaking down into smaller and smaller pieces. And the way that that came about was that, well, when I was younger, I was, well, concerned about the plastic on the seashore, and as a result, started measuring and counting a lot of the plastics that I could find on the seashore. It actually started with these blue pieces of rope. So where I grew up in West Lorcan, Ireland, there were a lot of little pieces of rope, like maybe 5 centimeters in size, with a knot in them, and they were bright blue. So I wanted to find out where they came from, because I'd say you couldn't walk more than about 30 centimeters on a beach without finding one of these pieces of blue rope. So with the blue rope, I quickly started looking around in my local area at different fishing and things like that. And it took me quite a while, but actually while kayaking, I found that there was mussel farming in play here. So the area was Roaring Water Bay in West Cork in Ireland. And this mussel farming seemed to have a system that they have these long tray kind of mesh bags for the mussel larvae, or I'm not quite sure what baby mussels are called. Well, you get the gist, baby mussels, small mussels to grew up in, and these were attached with these blue pieces of rope. And then I realized, well, these blue pieces of rope are actually quite polluting. So in our area, pretty much every beach was covered in bits of rope, and this was just from one of these farms. So I wondered, well, why are we not seeing more of the plastic waste we put into the ocean on our shores, right? If one whole area is basically covered in blue rope, you'd think that all the plastic waste that we're putting into the ocean would be everywhere on the beaches. And actually it kind of surprised me how clean the beaches were, which I know is something that a lot of people don't really say. But our beaches are pretty clean. We have some plastic, but it's not like the rubbish tip that we all hear about where the whole beach is covered in plastic. But what I realized is that, well, actually our beach is covered in plastic, and there is plastic everywhere. We just cannot see it. And that made me really, really scared, because basically these larger plastic particles are breaking down into smaller and smaller and even smaller pieces, eventually turning into microplastic particles, which are so small that we can't see them, but they wreak a lot more havoc in the oceans because we can't see them and a lot of fish can't see them. It also means that we breathe them in, or when we drink water, we drink them in. And similarly for a fish, when a fish is going through the ocean, it'll be taking in a lot of plastic as it swims through the waters.
Isn't there some kind of fact that our bodies, everyone's body now contains microplastics that are kind of there for life? Like there's things in our bodies that won't, we can't break down.
Absolutely. So when we take up some plastic, over time, it starts accumulating in our body. And this is called bioaccumulation. And because plastics are actually, I guess they feel a little bit more happy when they're in an oil medium. I know this sounds, all my chemistry friends would penalize me for this because we're not allowed to say that the things have emotions, but I do think it helps. But basically, there's a lower energy state when a plastic is surrounded by a non-polar medium. So that means that it would prefer to be in a non-polar medium, aka, for instance, in a fat or an oil. That means that when we take up plastics into our bodies, they will stick to lots of different fats and oils in our gut, but also as we take them up into our blood, because yes, these things can cross the gut barrier into our blood, they then start getting lodged in lots of different fats and tissues around the body. So actually, particularly fatty tissues often turn into these kind of hotspots for lots of very, very tiny plastic particles. And just for an example, if you think about the size of a human hair and its width, one of these particles is normally less than 1/10 of the width of a human hair. So super, super, super small, about the size of a red blood cell. So these things can flow freely inside our body, crossing the blood-brain barrier, and a lot more besides.
Gosh, it's really scary to think that, isn't it? And as well, there's something like there's more microplastics in the sea now than fish. Is that correct?
Well, I think there's a lot more microplastics in the sea now than fish. So much so that I think if you wash one singular fleece piece of clothing in a washing machine, you already release more individual microplastic particles than there are fish in the oceans. So in the oceans, there's many, many times more kilos of plastic pollution than there are fish. So by weight, but by particle number, it is through the roof. I think every single fish will contain tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of particles of plastic. And what worries me about this is that, well, the plastic itself isn't really the problem. Okay, we see plastic, we know that We know that we're taking it in, but the question is, well, what does it actually do inside the body? Well, if we think about it, this plastic pollution is actually composed of these particles again. There's lots of different kinds of plastic. Some of them are quite inert, right? We might have Teflon, which a lot of people would say is not particularly dangerous at all because it's so inert. We use it to make fake joints, but it sticks to a lot of different things. So a lot of these times, these plastics will build up a layer or build a biofilm on their outside, which is a layer of bacteria that like to grow on these oily surfaces. So that means that when we take in these plastics, we're taking in almost a little ecosystem of bacteria who are just ready to thrive inside our bodies too and wreak havoc there. Or if we're unlucky, these plastics might have encountered some toxic materials on their journeys through the oceans, or have taken up some heavy metals as they were lying on the bottom of the seabed. So when then we take up those plastics, we're actually taking up a lot of these toxic components too. And because the plastics can be so readily absorbed into the blood, it also means that we're transporting these all around our body, and these have been associated to quite a number of different diseases and problems.
Yeah, it's very scary when you really start to break this down. I mean,
absolutely.
Like you say, we've looked at a lot of things on this show in terms of some of the guests and looking at the kind of microscopic world, these things that are happening all around us, maybe even inside us, that you're just completely unaware of. Something that really fascinates me about your technology is that, I typically think a plastic is not something that is magnetized. But how do you get this technology to work where you can use a magnet to effectively collect plastic? Can you tell us a bit more about how this all works?
Well, I guess in my journey of microplastics, after realizing that they were there or hearing about them, I wanted to know how many there were where I grew up. So it sounds really trivial. You'd think that there's just some device which you can stick into the water and it'll tell you just like pH or salinity. But it's actually so not the case. There's actually no real standardized method to measure for plastics in water. So you'll see one metric of some wastewater saying, well, they didn't detect any plastic. And you see another metric saying that it was full of plastic from just different researchers on the same water sample. And that's because, there's so many different measurement techniques. So what I wanted to do was try and measure how much plastic I was taking in every single day. And that meant that I was looking at my well water where I grew up, but also at different drinking waters and, of course, the seawater as well. And I realized that, one glass of water already contained so much plastic that it was beyond and off the charts of a lot of different things. But to measure that, I actually built my own device, so a spectrometer. Basically, it works quite simply. It shines light through a sample of water, analyzes the light it gets back, and by the differences between the light it shone and the light it gets back, you can understand how much plastic there is in the water if you've calibrated the device. I built this using Legos and a couple of bits of wood. Remember, I was like 14, 15 years old. I wasn't close to a lab. I didn't really have a lot of lab resources. So I thought, well, what's the worst thing that can happen if I build my own device to do that? But I found out that, well, there's a lot of plastic and everybody was testing plastic at the time. It was like the thing to do. And still now a lot of people test for microplastics, but nobody was doing very much about them, right? They were telling this very big shocker story. But I think, as in a lot of environmental problems, we always have a lot of people trying to measure things about the problem and report on how dangerous it is. But of course, actually doing something about that problem often is a lot more work and takes a lot longer. So, well, I thought, well, what if I just try and filter these plastics from water, see how small they actually are, and figure out if we could just use some really, really cool sand filter or something that has very, very small size exclusion to do that. So experimenting with some ideas, I quickly realized that that's impossible. These plastics are so small that they can pass through pretty much any filter other than a reverse osmosis filter, which has so small pores and is so incredibly exclusive that it's super expensive to use on a large scale. So really not an option at all for large scale water treatment. But I also inherently learned something about the chemistry of plastics involved. And that was while walking along actually a beach, ironically, on the seashore, where I saw a lump of oil spill residue. So when a tanker or a ship loses some oil, the oil spill residue often clumps together into these kind of relatively solid clumps. But I could see that stuck to the surface of this clump were just loads of pieces of plastic. It was colorful with bits of plastic. So from this, I realized, well, that what we're seeing with the plastic pollution and what we're seeing with the waste that we have, well, maybe using oil could be a way to try and clump it together. Because plastics come from oil, they're non-polar, which means that when they're in a polar environment, such as water, they actually would tend to be in an area where it is non-polar. They'd want to clump together. And we can facilitate that by using some non-polar liquid. And I thought, well, what about oil? Of course, being quite young, I didn't want to use crude oil. Also, I thought, well, generating an oil spill is not maybe the best solution to our plastic problems. So I thought, well, what if we use a vegetable cooking oil, just like we use for, literally frying vegetables? And it worked pretty well. So I added some drops to a contaminated water sample, and I could see that I was clumping together all the plastics. But then the bigger problem is, well, how do I remove this oil mixed with plastics from water and not create a bigger waste problem than we already have? So to kind of combat this, I actually was at school and we were looking at magnetic liquids. These are ferrofluids. They're really cool. If anyone's played with them, you know that if you hold a magnet up to a ferrofluid, you get all these very cool patterns coming from the ferrofluid as it aligns with the magnetic field. But essentially, it's a suspension of oil with tiny magnetic particles mixed inside as well. These magnetic particles are iron oxide or rust. It's actually one of the most common minerals on Earth, which means that if you run along a beach with a magnet, you can actually get your own iron oxide powder. So in theory, it could even be a truly circular material. But by optimizing this powder, adding a couple of secret ingredients and changing the recipe a little bit with oil, I could make a liquid that was magnetic but would also conglomerate together with plastics. So then when I add just a couple of drops of this to some contaminated water, the plastics stick to the liquid, and then you can remove that liquid mixture from water using magnets.
That's pretty cool. I've got to be honest.
Well, I think that's exactly what I said the first time I tried it out.
It must have been an incredible moment for you to suddenly have this, like, I don't know, this eureka moment, right? Sat there in a lab, or was that something that happened suddenly, or was this a kind of gradual process?
I think the eureka moment is something that a lot of people like to talk to me about. And I think that looking at science and innovation as something where you're looking at an outcome or a eureka moment or something that you've generated as a result of what you do is a little bit dangerous, because I think that if we ever do science or innovate in a way that fosters the idea that it's all about the outcome or it's all about what you've created, that sometimes means that you might not be quite as creative because you know where you want to go. So then you're kind of biased on what you want to achieve. But I think it felt really good when I saw that this worked. But in true inventor style, I don't think I believed it myself until I had tested it so extensively that there was no eureka moment per se, but it was something that grew on me over time. To be very honest, I didn't actually feel very excited at the point because I still didn't really believe my home-built apparatus made of Lego. But instead, I actually felt quite empowered and excited to test it a lot more and ultimately also see whether doing a couple of other experiments and doing a couple of other application experiments, I could actually try and apply this to some real-world water.
And I guess that's got to be the next step. Surely, I mean, this is real game-changing technology that you've invented. You know, what's the potential application in terms of how could this be used to clean the oceans, and how long could that take maybe? I don't know. Could you give us an insight into that?
Well, I guess remember that I was quite young at the time. I mean, I was a teenager in the middle of nowhere in Ireland. Now, this, of course, helps in certain ways. I guess one of the ways that it really, really helped is that, well, growing up in such a remote place, it feels like a lot of things are possible because, I mean, the whole community will listen to you or take part. If you want to organize a beach cleanup, you'll always have people to come with you. And it doesn't feel as anonymous as a city. It feels like you can actually have an influence on your very, very small world quite easily. Which means that if you want to test or experiment with somebody, most people are pretty helpful and most people would want to support in whatever way they can. I guess the downside is that you're really far away from any research institution. So if you want to test it in an independent way or get some support, it's almost impossible. And actually at the time, I reached out to the local university, so UCC in Cork, and asked them if I could maybe come by, run a couple of tests. And I had a really, well, in my opinion, really, really good research plan. And I was just completely brushed off by them. They had absolutely no interest in doing anything. So I thought, well, I have to build my own equipment to test. So I went back, I made my own specialized microscope and spectrometer and saw that, well, this method does work. And I proved it with like 4,000 or 5,000 different tests, different plastics, different water types, etc., until I had convinced myself that it worked. And then I was stuck in a very, very weird situation where I had something that worked, but I didn't have a clue what to do with it.
Yeah, that's an interesting dynamic to find yourself in that predicament, for sure. So what did you do next?
Well, I think what I did next was what any teenager does who enjoys science, and that was bring it to a science fair. So there's a lot of different science fairs for young people to show their ideas. It feels like certain science fairs you go to, and a lot of the projects are people doing very, very fundamental science research or looking at a lot of different ecological things. But I went to the National Irish Science Fair, which is the BT Young Scientist, and there I exhibited my project. I'd actually exhibited a couple of times in the past before. So I went the first time when I was 12 with a project about pond snails and looking at water turbidity. So I had made a little device that could measure how turbid water was and then how snails could clean up the water. I mean, I learned a lot from that project. One of the things was that I'll never forget the Latin spelling of the type of snail that I was studying, Limnea stagnalis. I think that haunts me in my sleep. The next project after that was actually about berries. So I was looking at the antioxidant levels of different berries. So I used a home-built apparatus that I built to measure the antioxidant levels. So you could put in a food sample and it would tell you. It was actually quite similar to the plastics in a weird way because it relied on using light to measure things. But then when I exhibited the plastic project, well, before this, all these little small projects, I didn't have very much success. Like I didn't win very many prizes. But with the plastic one, I had a lot of attention. And very quickly, I knew that I was in the running to get a prize of sorts, which I then did do. So I got a travel award, one of the top awards, which sent me to another science competition where I did the whole thing again. And there I got more awards, which sent me to another one. And it was kind of this chain of science fairs. But I think the science fair business model, or actually the model around it, is great for getting people into science, and it really definitely motivated the innovation that I did. But undoubtedly, I also feel like it didn't very much help me in what I should do next, because a lot of these fairs, it felt like you got the prize and then out the door you go. So it wasn't until over a year later when I exhibited in a global science fair called the Google Science Fair with my project, which I then won. So I won the global prize in Google headquarters in California, that I thought, well, I must be onto something. If like all these scientists thought that this project is worthy of a prize, well, I must be onto something. And of course, with all the media interviews, etc., that I got from it, including media from, for instance, Forbes, Business Insider, etc., I thought, well, now is a perfect time to try actually commercializing this.
I mean, that must have been an incredible moment to win the Google Science Project Fair. But how old were you at this point?
I was 18.
I mean, that's just, yeah, that in itself is, you must see yourself as a bit of a game changer, surely, doing something like that.
I think that for me, being a game changer only really comes into play when you actually bring about a change, right? So what have I actually achieved in that point as change? Well, I had a project that won a lot of awards, but did I actually do anything about the microplastic problem? No, probably not. I actually probably contributed to microplastics by flying around and doing so much different things for these projects. So I think that the way you measure change is something that can be argued in a lot of different ways. But for me, it's very much about, well, a scientific change. So for instance, pollution levels, or a change in the way people act and work, so inspiring other people to take action. So moving forward after that science fair project and that prize, I wanted to actually create more change. So that's kind of what drove me to try and do that. So of course, the first thing was to try and figure out, well, how could one potentially put this on a slightly more commercial scale? How could one potentially filter the water and clean it up to remove plastics from it? And how could one potentially make it such that it could be used by a lot of people? And I kind of got my first bit of funding through the World Economic Forum. So I spoke at the World Economic Forum in Davos. I was invited as a speaker in 2020, just before COVID. I think all of us actually got COVID after that forum because of the forum. And I think we met everybody and we were all super sick afterwards. It was like just before March 2020. But at that forum in the speaker's green lounge, I was sitting down and somebody came up to me and he looked kind of vaguely familiar, but I didn't really know who it was. And he started speaking to me about my project and he was like, oh, I just saw your talk. And I was like, oh, thanks. And he was like, yeah, well, I would actually like to support you. And I thought, well, that's nice. He'd like to support my project. And after this huge long conversation where we were talking about all these different things, he failed to mention that he was called Robert Downey Jr. and he was an actor and that he wanted to give me money. So it was quite a bizarre conversation. Probably wrong for me for not recognizing, but actually I think it was good. Maybe I treated him like anybody else, which was really nice. And as a result, it built this relationship that we still hold today, where through the nonprofit that he has, the Footprint Coalition, we were able to get our first round of funding, which was non-equity based, so entirely grant funding, to build a prototype, test it with independent engineers in the US, which we did to remove plastics from water on a continuous flow scale. So with that, we had a device. You could put it on a table. Water could flow through the device and you could clean up that water pretty effectively.
So now you have the technology, you've proven it, you have a bench-tested model that can show how this could work on a commercial scale. But what's the next step? Could this be rolled out onto our oceans to basically clean them up bit by bit?
Well, we have to think about what we want to achieve here. Most plastics enter the oceans through the rivers and waterways from our own wastewater. So if we can implement this in a wastewater treatment setting or a drinking water treatment setting, that's where we can have the biggest impact. Because if we're cleaning up in the sea, well, it doesn't help to clean up the sea before we try and stop it at its source. So for me, the next focus was majorly to look at waste and drinking water treatment and using that to remove the plastics from water there and applying the technology to there. So moving forward from this, we started working with some more engineers who wanted to test it with different water streams, etc. And that kind of leaves us at the point where we are today, where we're just about to raise a round of investment to be able to build a much, much larger scale device. So this one is on the order of thousands of litres for large flow-through capacities to remove large quantities of plastic from water in a shorter period of time and ultimately be applied in water treatment. I think what makes this quite unique, though, is that there's a commercial and non-commercial aspect to this. So I guess the commercial aspect is, of course, that, well, anybody could use this in their commercial water cleaning endeavors. So if that's a water or plastic recycling company, or if that's a private water treatment company who might be working for a beverage company to produce purified water for beverages, which probably are packed in plastic again. So, I mean, it gets a full circle. You're re-adding plastic pollution. But I think that that's kind of the commercial aspect. And then the more non-profit aspect is looking at places where water enters the oceans. So this could be in outflows of rivers or wastewater treatment plants. And then ultimately also to implement this in the sea as well. The way I see this working in the sea is not by just spreading this liquid over the surface of the sea. That would be a really stupid idea. But instead actually looking at shipping, because I mean, we have hundreds of thousands of ships traversing the oceans every single day. So if we could use the water filtration that they already have inside ships and the cooling water that they have to pump in all the time to apply our technology, well, then we could use commercial shipping that already is happening as a way to pick up plastics as well.
So you're almost piggybacking onto all these ships going around the world to just continually have this cumulative effect of cleaning the water as they go.
Exactly. I think that's the vision here.
Fionn, I want to ask you a few quick-fire questions because we do this with everyone on the show. This is a section called How Dare You? What was the last new thing that you tried?
Actually, a really good question. I think so. Something that I tried just before coming to the UK, actually, for this trip, which I know it sounds a bit bizarre, but I love hiking, but I don't think I have ever hiked in like a really bad storm before. So it put me out of my comfort zone. We went on a hike. There were three of us. We hiked Ireland's highest mountain, and we had it planned for a while, but it was like, I mean, the weather last week was pouring rain. I mean, like 5 degrees Celsius, like hailstones and 120 kilometers per hour wind, like hurricane force wind. And we decided to hike Ireland's highest mountain, and we had to, like, there was zero visibility. It was like super like steep climbing in between, like almost a level where you needed ropes. Everything was slippery, super dangerous. We survived. We got completely wet and cold. I just really enjoyed it. So that was one of the things that put me out of my comfort zone very recently. And it was one of those hikes where it wasn't really about the views, because I mean, there were no views other than like 2 meters ahead of you and 2 meters behind you. But it felt like, you know, when you have to grit your teeth and you're facing the rain, it felt like I was an Arctic explorer, more so than when I was actually living in the Arctic. So
that sounds like a pretty intense experience. But I mean, my follow-up question was, what's the thing you want to try but you don't dare? But by the sounds of that, you know, you're quite comfortable confronting adversity head on, would you say?
I think some things that I would like to try that I don't dare are things that might actually be, I don't know, related to my work sometimes. I feel like often now I speak at a lot of conferences and I work on a lot of different events, but certain things, I feel like there's sometimes a bit of a stigma attached and you have to answer in certain ways. And sometimes it feels like not that you're not telling your mission, but you kind of fall into old tracks. So sometimes I'm on a TV show or an interview, not like this one, of course, but sometimes I feel like I would really, really like to say something about, I don't know, some plastic practices or whatever in the studio, and I absolutely cannot, right? Like I was just handed like a plastic glass of water, by the way, not here, right? You can see this lovely porcelain mug, so don't worry, and you're also drinking out of a glass. But sometimes I just feel like, I mean, I've been covered in plastic, microplastic makeup to sit here on stage to talk about microplastic waste, and I find that a little bit difficult. So if I had maybe a little bit more courage and I wasn't so worried about that, I would probably call people out as well. But as of yet, I haven't quite dared, but sometimes I do poke a little bit.
Well, I think it's important to poke a little bit and push back at times, isn't it? I understand where you're coming from in terms of sometimes you want to say certain things, and it's never a good feeling to feel as though you're compromising your integrity.
I think I'm getting a lot better at it. I don't know. I think actually what I've realized is that crowds, so when I'm doing this in a live show or so, they absolutely love it when you confront the show. So actually probably I'll never be hired again after this podcast. But I feel like it actually works really, really well with the audience when you maybe are a little bit critical sometimes of how things are done.
I think people appreciate that, you know, when they feel like they're getting to the real you, they're hearing who you really are and the things that actually you do want to say, as opposed to like you say, I think you know, for anyone who's in the public, who does a lot of interviews, a lot of television, things like that, you do fall into those little rhythms of saying the same things, and it's very easy to feel sometimes like you're repeating yourself, rather than saying the things that we need to push ourselves to.
Well, I always put a lot of effort into, like, particularly when I'm giving talks at conferences, I put a huge amount of effort into like preparing this talk that's going to have all these lovely educational outcomes and teach people a lot to be their own inventors and everything. And then I often talk to the organizers of events and they're like, no, we just want to hear your story. And I'm like, well, I don't know, I've given this story like a couple of times now. I've told my story. And I think I often undervalue that, like, people have not maybe previously heard about me, and then I guess the story is good. But I sometimes get like, I feel like I want to give all this information, and then all they want is me to tell my story on this talk, like I've done the previous year at the same conference. And then sometimes I find it quite funny how you can fall into this rhythm of saying almost the same phrases to what they asked, etc. But I always find it funny that sometimes I put so much effort in, and then they want one of the out of the can talks again.
I know exactly where you're coming from on that. As someone who does quite a bit of public speaking, it's funny because you're always in front of people who perhaps haven't heard your story before. Yeah. And you've told it so many times, you have to remind yourself of that fact that people might be hearing this as new information. And
you feel so fake because you feel like you're recycling content. Like for me, I'm talking about what I did like 5 years ago now. So I feel like that's kind of old, and I've done so many more exciting things in the past couple of years. And I feel like almost like, okay, I've been brought here to speak on stage about what I did 5 years ago. Like, hang on a moment, like, aren't there more interesting and bigger change makers in the world? So sometimes I do feel like that, but then I also realize that not everybody's heard my story, and that's actually quite a nice feeling then as well.
Yeah, and I think as well, you know, the things that you've told me about, the things we've discussed, they are bringing really important changes. So I don't think you should discount the contribution that you're making. I mean, on that tack, where do you What other changes would you like to see in your field, see happening out there in terms of, I don't know, oceanography or anything?
Well, I wouldn't say, first of all, that I'm an oceanographer. I actually moved to the Arctic last year. So I lived in the most northern town in the world, in Svalbard. So it's this tiny island archipelago off the coast of Norway. It's super cold. You have 24-hour darkness, and then all of a sudden one sunrise, and then you're in 24-hour bright. I absolutely loved living there. But I studied Arctic chemical oceanography there for the semester and absolutely love it. But I wouldn't consider myself an oceanographer. Instead, I consider myself more a scientist, because I don't actually study the movement of these plastics in the ocean, but instead look at, how we can combat them from a more flow-based approach. But I think in that world, and actually living in the Arctic, showed me that something a lot of people don't see or definitely underestimate is how far our pollution reaches in the world. I mean, you could find a piece of plastic from probably every single country in the world in just a block of ice of 1 by 1 meter in the Arctic. It felt like every single place I visited was full of plastic. Every ocean sample we took, which is literally the most remote place on planet Earth, had plastic inside. And it felt like wherever you went, you would see traces of human remains. Or, well, not like human as in the dead explorers. I mean, you also found those. But instead, well, most of them were eaten by polar bears, but you might find the bones. But you definitely saw remains from human activity. And for me, that just actually was a little bit depressing, because, I mean, we're just animals that live on this planet, just like so many other animals. And why do we have to dominate the planet in terms of waste, in terms of the way the planet looks? So I think that it should be a mindset shift that we have, that, we're just residents here and we should leave no trace, ideally, or at least try and leave it as clean and nicely as possible as we found it.
Yeah, I think that's pretty good. I'd sign up to that right now, I think. What do you think will be the next big game changer we see in this field?
Well, I think in terms of plastic pollution, the best thing we can do is stop producing plastic waste. And it's more difficult said than done. But I think what we need to look at plastic as is not a bad material. Plastic is a wonderful material. I mean, it is so long lasting. It is so easy to mold. It is incredibly cheap to produce. So why are we wasting this really, really nice material on single-use items? I mean, a chair that's made from plastic that lasts 5 years, I think is a great product. It's probably actually better for the environment than a lot of other things. So instead, what I think we should really, really focus on is ways that actual plastic waste can be minimized. And if we produce plastic waste, or in general plastics, that it's something that we deal with in a specific way. So I think a couple of changes that we'll see coming about in the future will be, first of all, about single-use packaging, just more rules about this, or trying to avoid it altogether. I mean, there are alternatives in pretty much every single packaging sphere that are plastic-free. It just means that these cost a little bit more, or are a little bit more inconvenient, or are not quite as implemented yet. So I think that that's something that we can really, really see. But in terms of the long-use plastics, the ones that last a long time, I think we'll also see a shift towards less kinds of plastic. So, I mean, if we only have 4 or 5 types of plastic that are in use, it makes recycling so much easier instead of the 10 to 15,000 different kinds we have now. So I think actually focusing the plastics that we do use and do permit to be used will be a really important step in this field as well in the future.
I think we're often looking on this show, looking at boundaries, breaking through barriers, things like that. And I think when we look at the whole topic of the planet and saving the planet and improving things, I think everybody's in agreement that's something that requires pretty massive action. At what point do you think, that action is something that potentially, say, affects people's liberties, because you reach a point where you're saying, well, we can do this, we can't do this, we're going to stop having this. Where do you draw the line with that? Where do those boundaries, where do you see that being? Is it about saying an industry, like you say, right, we're just going to limit this to 5 types of plastics? Or is it about saying to people, as an individual, we've all got to take some responsibility at some point. And where do you think those boundaries lie, and where can they be broken? Where should they be left?
Very difficult question, right? Because I mean, if we ask the industry people why they produce plastic products, they say, well, our customers buy it. And if we ask the customers why they're buying plastic products, they say, well, that's all that we can find on the shelves. So inevitably, I think we will have to make sacrifices, and at least I already do make quite a lot of sacrifices. And I think that actually by making sacrifices to a product that might be a bit more inconvenient or a little bit better for the environment, and it might even feel like it doesn't actually do much difference, I think that already shows a mindset shift, and it promotes industries and promotes people who care a lot more about producing products that are good for the planet as a whole. So I think that this mindset shift and this shift away from plastic inevitably does require us to make a lot of sacrifices in our way of life and some of the choices that we make. But I mean, is that really such a big price to pay if we can then live in a place where, first of all, we don't see all the ugly plastic pollution, but also we're not suffering from a lot of the diseases and problems associated with plastic? I don't know, but I think giving up the plastic packaged deodorant or whatever, I think it's actually worth that.
Yeah, I completely agree. Fionn, I just want to ask you really one last question off the back of that. For all our listeners at home, is there one little nugget of wisdom that you can leave people with that they can do to make an impact in their lives?
I think that a lot of people think that in general, environmental or societal problems are ones that you can't really do much about yourself. And particularly environment ones, I think I'm not very good with dealing with people, so I'm probably the wrong person to ask about other ones. I think that for the environment, it's such a new space doing things for the environment. And it might not sound that new, right? That people have been doing this for a long time, but it's such a new space where every idea has the power to really have a big impact, that there are no professionals, there are no people who are experts. I mean, if you Googled microplastics on Wikipedia, I would come up as like an expert, a world expert on microplastics after just working on this for like 2 years, and I was 16 years old. So it shows that you can be an expert in whatever field you like if you just narrow your mind enough. And I think a narrowed mind is something that most people don't suggest for people to do. But I think that if we narrow our field so much that you can read everything about that field, feel really empowered to do a change, and then have an idea to change about it, I think that is great. So become a world expert in what you think is important. Become a world expert in the area that you would like to change. And as long as you keep it narrow enough, you can definitely create change. And I think every idea has the power to change our world.
Fionn, that was so inspiring, and a perfect way to conclude our episode today. Thank you so much for coming on the show. It's really been an honour to sit and interview you.
Well, I had a great time. I think it was a great start to my day.
Well, I'm happy to hear that. And if people want to follow you, you have a television programme, you have obviously social media. Can you just leave our listeners with a few ideas on what they can do to keep up with what you're up to?
Well, I have actually a really exciting year ahead. So many cool announcements. I mean, my technology is growing in a couple of ways. So I think we'll close on this round of investment pretty soon. But we also have engineers lined up who are ready to work and build a new device. So you'll see all of that. My Instagram, Fionn Ferreira, or Fionn.Ferreira. I also have some stuff on YouTube and all the other channels as well. If you want to see my travel content, you can look at my TikTok. You can see me going to all the little sustainable places all over the world. But really exciting on the horizon is that I have a kids TV show, which is coming out on several networks across UK and Ireland. And this show is one which I host, where I bring lots of kind of unsung voices in the climate space. So think about those young people who are actually just doing action in their local communities, or they have a little startup making something small that's good for the environment. That is what my show is all about. I bring them to studio, they do a game show, we pair them with scientists, pair them with innovators, and ultimately they can pitch their ideas for the Golden Brain Box Award. So super fun show. That's on the horizon. Next thing on the horizon that's also super exciting is that I am actually a team principal of an electric scooter racing series. So a bit like BMW, I'm sure the BMW fans here will be interested in this, but it's the world's first racing series for electric scooters. So these are literally the scooters that you probably see standing around the city, but we have ones that can go over 80 miles an hour, so almost 100 kilometers an hour. They go around a racehorse. I have a beautiful team of incredible people who I am managing, and we're excited for this new racing series. So it's called ESC Live, I think anyone can tune in and see us race.
Well, I'll certainly be tuning in to see how you do, and wishing your team all the best. Fionn, it's been a pleasure, really. Thank you so much. I hope all our listeners have enjoyed that today and feeling as inspired as I do as I go on to the rest of my day. So please come back for another amazing episode of Game Changer, and I'll see you all there, folks. All the best.